So I'll say I get a little bit of comfort and relief in thinking about the calendar and the days ahead, because the week that we are now leaving behind was quite a week. These have been days of difficulty and pain in our congregation, a time of anxiety for many, and for others, a time of deep fear. This week that we're now leaving behind has been a week of upheaval and tumult that have led many of us to deep and searching questions about Jewish community more broadly, about Jewish life and Jewish hope and Jewish trauma, questions which grew even more urgently pointed just a few hours ago when we heard and absorbed the news about a gruesome attack outside a Jerusalem synagogue, just in the hours of the new hours of Shabbat. I know that all of us here are united in our desire that the victims' families will find comfort after an unforgivable act of violence. But even when they do, those pointed questions will remain before us. What does it take to make us feel safe? What physical precautions and policy steps will be required? How many doors, how many locks, how many cameras and fences and guards will be enough so that we won't have to feel afraid ever again? We are, of course, not the first ones to ask these questions. Ours is certainly not the first Jewish community to face fear and uncertainty and to wonder what, if anything, lies on the other side of it. This week, Jewish communities all over the world, including our own, read about the chilling climax of the story of our ancestors' slavery and the night of great terror when the 10th and final plague was visited on Egypt. What must that have been like? What must have been like for Israelite families in Egypt on that most fearful of nights? What must they have felt when peril and violence were close enough to be touched? How did they tremble when they shut their doors against the dark angel sweeping silently through the streets to steal away the breath of the innocent? Most of us remember the story well enough from Sunday school or from our Passover Seders or from the last time we watched The Prince of Egypt about how the Israelites painted the doorposts of their homes with lamb's blood to keep their families safe from destruction. The mark there on the doorway stood out brightly like an amulet of protection to keep evil and violence far away. But there was a rabbi who wrote and taught in medieval Europe who somewhat famously remembers and imagines this scene as having happened a bit differently. In his reading, rather than painting the mark on the outside of the doorposts like a mezuzah, this rabbi supposed that the ancient Israelites painted it on the inside of the door, so that when the door was closed, the sign could only be seen by the people who lived there, not by anyone outside the house. And so the mark on the doorpost wasn't there to warn off the destructive force that might have tried to enter the Israelite homes. Instead, it was painted there so that each individual family would be reminded of who they were, so that even amid the darkest terrors of the night, they would remember. They'd remember their commitment, they'd remember their people and their covenant and their God. Now, that reading offers us what I think is a vital perspective about what protection really means, what safety really looks like. Because God's protection isn't quite the same thing as the officers who stand outside our doors with badges and guns, who, by the way, I'm very glad are there. But instead, the way God offers protection to communities of faith like ours is by granting us a sense of assurance, a sense of purpose, a sense of stability, rooted ever more firmly in every individual decision we make to acknowledge who we are and what we value. Every time we willingly choose to accept our heritage and our shared responsibility for each other and for our sacred spaces, we are granted, as it were, an extra measure of divine shelter and protection. I truly believe that that is true. Now, I want to very quickly remind you that this building is protected by far more than God's presence, and I don't believe that anyone should have any reason to feel unsafe here. And at the same time, I also want to say out loud that feeling unsafe and feeling afraid is a rational and understandable thing to do after difficult events that we go through. So I'm not going to tell you that you shouldn't feel fear. Instead, I'm going to tell you that this is a place where you can bring your fear and still feel joy. This is a place where you can feel beloved and appreciated and inspired even while holding your fear the whole time. Because this is what it means to be part of the beautiful and timeless Jewish people. This is what our people is: suffering and dancing, grief and joy, salt water and honey, eternally and inseparably braided together for all time. Jewish redemption doesn't take place in heaven. It doesn't take place in some rarefied mountaintop in the promised land. It takes place here. It happens in the same homes and neighborhoods and synagogues where we feel our fear and uncertainty and pain. The great climax of the Torah story, the most powerful evidence of God's mighty hand and outstretched arm, doesn't appear on Mount Sinai. It doesn't appear in the Garden of Eden. It doesn't even appear in the thundering, parted waters of the Red Sea. The place that we find incontrovertible, transformative proof of God's protection and God's love is in the humble dwellings of Egypt's Israelite slaves. The marks on their doorposts reminded them, and they remind us too today, who we are and to whom we belong. Our safety and our protection emerges organically from those recognitions and from every one of our commitments to the covenants and to each other. Do I think the Israelites in Egypt locked their doors? Yes, I do. And we need to also, because locked doors and watchful eyes keep people safe. But the signs on our doorposts, the words written there that we teach to our children and speak of them when we lie down and when we rise up, those signs are not tactical security equipment. They are there and they are here because when we find ourselves sunk in fear and doubt, we turn back to them and we remember who we are and what we owe to our spiritual community. Jewish life can't be lived in isolation. Jewish community can't be maintained in solitude. We need each other. We need these words, we need these songs, we need these prayers, we need these places. And when we come here, when we reach out to each other, we find, strangely and miraculously, divine protection at hand. I want all of you to be here with me. I want you to read the story of that gruesome 10th plague as a story not about destruction or vengeance, but about commitment and hope, about vision and resolve. There will be dark days, there will be fear, of course there will. There always will be. But I want you to bring your fear here. Wait out the darkness here. Bring your hearts here. And in those times of deepest and darkest despair, keep your eyes open for the sign on the doorpost. It's like a briefly shimmering wink of light. And when you see it, you'll remember that you are not alone. This week we finish reading the saga of Israelite slavery in Egypt. And the end of that story is not without tragedy and heartbreak. Pharaoh chooses to continue hardening his heart, to choose violence and spite over humility and hope. But the Passover story, the Jewish story, is a story of triumph. It is a story about people, our people, who made a choice to stand up in the light of the morning, even with the scars still on their backs and the fear still in their hearts, to stand up and choose to walk into the unknown toward a redemption and toward promise to life. I hope you will come with me. Shabbat shalom, everybody.